Good afternoon and welcome to this lecture on liberalism and governmentality. I'm going to use the lecture to talk about Michel Foucault's proposed genealogy of modern liberal governmentality and its relevance to political philosophy. There are, of course, well-known objections to the idea that studying the history of political thought has any relevance for normative political philosophy. So, for example, the restriction of the domain of political philosophy to ideal theory provides one way to dissociate core liberal ideas from their historical entanglement in the maintenance of racial or sexual hierarchies and the establishment of colonial empires. If, as Rawls suggests, the task of the theorist is to construct a conceptually consistent conception of liberalism that is more or less consistent with contemporary ideas of what is fair, reasonable, and just, why should the normative theorist be concerned with the history of those ideas and their relationship to various practices of government? The relevance of genealogical approaches to political philosophy is the subject of considerable recent debate. In this lecture, I propose to examine Foucault's genealogy of liberal government, or governmentality, as he calls it, with a view to its relevance for normative political theory. Elements of Rawls's liberalism will provide a case study for the development and application of this Foucauldian project. And I suggest that there are a variety of ways in which Foucault's genealogy bears on normative theorizing, and provide three examples based on his 1978 and 1979 lectures. In the first part of this lecture, I will introduce Foucault's concept of governmentality and his remarks about the origins of liberal government in the 18th century. I then argue that governmentality implies an internal relationship between normative principles and the practice of government. And I will illustrate this by reference, firstly, to remarks by Foucault about the role of freedom in liberal government and remarks about a possible socialist governmentality. And secondly, I will illustrate it by reference to Rawls's account of the institutions of government required by his theory of justice. In the second part of the lecture, I argue that governmentality or governmental reason, as defined by Foucault, will form part of public reason, as defined by Rawls. It follows that Foucault's sketch of a genealogy of liberal and neoliberal governmentality is also a contribution to the history of modern public reason. In the third part, I argue that Foucault's genealogy of liberal and neoliberal governmentality shows up the tension in liberal normative theorizing, according to whether it deals with juridical subjects or subjects of interest. And it provides a useful framework in which to understand Rawls's reconciliation of the two. Finally, I suggest that Foucault's account of economic legitimacy in the post-war German Federal Republic points to a theoretical possibility largely unexplored in contemporary liberal theories of legitimacy. So, my first section, governmentality and normative political theory. Foucault is best known in political philosophy for his contributions to the analysis of power, primarily in work published in the mid-1970s, Discipline and Punish, that was published in French in 1975, and The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, published in French in 1976. The focus of his analysis of power in these books was a particular form of power that he variously described as capillary power, micro, or disciplinary power, a power that was exercised over bodies and collectivities throughout modern societies. The concept of power outlined in these two books has been the subject of exhaustive debate and fierce criticism, the latter especially from political philosophers irritated by the lack of any overt normative dimension to his analysis. Political philosophers tended to see his work as fatally flawed, confused, or in the case of Jürgen Habermas, as a renewed form of anti-modernist and anti-intellectual conservatism. Michael Walzer's response was in some ways more sympathetic. He saw Foucault as a fellow leftist, but in other ways it was no less critical. Walzer, too, drew attention to the absence of normative standards in Foucault's work in a manner that echoed criticisms made by Nancy Fraser, and later repeated by Habermas, by Charles Taylor, and many others. Walzer also criticized Foucault as a nihilist who endorsed no values that might provide grounds for moral or political evaluation. As such, he argued, Foucault gave us no reason to expect that new forms of power would be any better than old ones, and more importantly, failed to address the normative principles that underpin such judgments. Quoting Walzer, nor for that matter does he give us any way of knowing what better might mean. The concept of power was central to Foucault's work during the early 1970s, not only in Discipline and Punish, but also in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, where he outlined a project, the whole point of which, as he said in a 1977 interview, lay in a re-elaboration of the theory of power. He gave frequent summaries, theses, and responses to questions from interviewers about the nature of power and how it should be studied. Power was dispersed throughout the social body. It should be studied at the periphery in its effect on bodies. It should be studied from the ground up, and so on. Walzer took these methodological injunctions to imply that, as he put it, citizenship and government alike have been superseded, and yet the whole point of modern political theory since the absolutist state, provided the ground on which it was constructed, has been to account for these two things, citizenship and government, that is. Walzer's conception of the whole point of modern political theory underpins his criticism that, in the end, Foucault did not have a political theory, or, if we persist in calling his work political theory, then it suffers catastrophic weakness by virtue of the absence of any consideration of democratic citizenship or the liberal state. Now, like much of the criticism of Foucault's work published in English in the early 1980s, and indeed some of the defenses of his approach, Walzer's criticism was founded on complete ignorance of Foucault's political philosophy after 1976. It is not surprising that the lectures of 1977-78, published in English under the title Security, Territory, Population, and the 1978-1979 lectures, The Birth of Biopolitics, played no role in these evaluations by Walzer and others. They were not published in French until 2004, and then in English in 2007, 2008, respectively. But it is in these lectures that Foucault began to focus on modern views about the exercise of sovereign power from the 16th through the 18th and 19th century. As in his earlier work on discipline and micropower, he remained focused on the descriptive analysis of power and on the question, as he put it, how power is exercised, whether by individuals, institutions, or the state. But from his 1977-78 lectures onwards, the analysis of power is focused not on individuals or small groups, but on whole populations. Eventually, these lectures came to concentrate on the distinguishing features of liberal government as it emerged in the course of the 18th century. Foucault's lectures in 1978 and 1979 develop an account of liberalism as a novel form of government that sought to reconcile the practice of government with the operation of a market economy. The significant changes in Foucault's conceptualization of power, along with his explicit attention to the forms of exercise of state power, provided a direct rebuttal of Walzer's claim that Foucault pays no attention to the state, in particular, the liberal state. He doesn't, it's true, address the nature of the modern democratic state and citizenship. He does address the nature of the modern democratic state and citizenship, although not in terms of the search for jurisprudential principles of just or legitimate government. Rather, he develops an approach to the exercise of state power that is at once historical and descriptive, but also, in a sense, ideal. This approach is focused on the manner in which governments were supposed to act in the view of the practitioners, advisors, and theorists of the business of government, whose writings provide the corpus for the study of what Foucault came to call governmentality. The shift of perspective undertaken in these lectures during 1978 and 1979 meant that he no longer insisted on the importance of studying power from below or at the capillary extremes of its exercise in the social body. Instead, from the fourth lecture of his 1977-78 course onwards, he embarked on an ambitious study of the different ways in which power was supposed to be exercised at the level of society as a whole. The remainder of Foucault's 1978 lectures sketch a history of some of the major forms of governmentality, including pastoral government, the manner in which the reason of state doctrine elaborated a theory of the police or the policing of the social and political life of the polity, and finally, the emergence of liberal governmentality from the middle of the 18th century onwards. Foucault's 1979 lectures then turn to the neoliberal governmentality that developed in the course of the 20th century. The first lecture of the 1979 course, Birth of Biopolitics, gives a concise explanation of what he meant by this term, governmentality. He describes the focus of these lectures as the history of what could be called the art of government, by which he means political government, or, as he puts it, the government of men insofar as it appears as the exercise of political sovereignty. More precisely, Foucault's approach is confined to a specific dimension, not the actual practice of government, but the rationalization of this practice, or, as he says, the reasoned way of governing best and, at the same time, reflection on the best possible way of governing. It's in this sense that there's a degree of idealization in Foucault's otherwise descriptive approach. He's concerned with the theorization of the practice of government, as he puts it, the study of the rationalization of government practice in the exercise of political sovereignty. To see what the analysis of governmentality looks like, it's helpful to consider an example from Foucault's 1978 lectures. And this example, I think, speaks to his account of the birth of specifically liberal government in the course of the 18th century. The lecture that Foucault gave on the 18th of January 1978 introduced the basic elements of the new form of governmental power that emerged in Europe in the course of the 18th century. This lecture was devoted to proposals put forward in France in the middle of that century to deal with the problem of grain shortage, what was called in French at the time, la disette, meaning dearth or scarcity. La disette was defined as, quote, the present insufficiency of the amount of grain necessary for a nation's subsistence. Grain shortage was a threat to governments because it could lead quickly to revolt on the part of urban populations deprived of food. Previously, this problem had been dealt with by regulations intended to prevent such shortages from occurring. Measures that included, quoting Foucault, price control and especially control of the right to store, the prohibition of hoarding with the consequent necessity of immediate sale, limits on export, the prohibition of sending grain abroad with, as the simple restriction on this, the limitation of the extent of land under cultivation, because if the cultivation of grain is too extensive, the surplus from this abundance will result in a collapse of prices so that the peasants will not break even. From the end of the 17th century, however, some economic advisors to the French monarchy argued that the free circulation of grain along the lines of the English model was a better mechanism to ensure food security. This was a key proposition defended by physiocrats such as Quesnay, who became influential in French economic policy in the 1750s. Foucault examines a particular text, a defense outlined by Louis-Paul Abbé in a text published in 1763 called Letter from a Trader on the Nature of the Grain Trade. Now, Abbé served as secretary to the Bureau of Commerce during the 1760s, and Foucault proposes to consider this indicative text, as he puts it, from the perspective of a genealogy of technologies of power. And he suggested that edicts of the French government in 1763 and 1764 that followed the recommendations outlined in Abe's text. These edicts introduced a radically new policy for dealing with the problem of grain shortage, one that, in Foucault's words, amounted to a complete change, or rather a phase in a major change in the techniques of government. This new policy sought to take into account not just the market price of grain, but the whole economic cycle of production and circulation that produced more or less grain. Rather than artificially setting a low price, it sought to allow for and even favor a higher price so that more investment would be made in production. It recommended the removal of restrictions on hoarding, on the export and import of grain, and on the extent of land devoted to its production, in order to rely on market mechanisms to stabilize the price and the supply of grain. It involved a conception of market mechanisms that, in Foucault's terms, was, quote, not just the analysis of what happens, it is at once an analysis of what happens and a program for what should happen. In order to develop this program, Foucault pointed out, the analysis of the production of grain had to be broadened in several respects. First, on the side of production, it had to consider the entire cycle, from the initial actions of producers up to the final profit. Second, on the side of the market, the analysis had to consider not just the domestic market, but all of the potential international sources of grain. And thirdly, the analysis had to be broadened on the side of the protagonists in order to understand, quoting Foucault, how and why they act, what calculation they make when, faced with a price rise, they hold back grain, and what calculation they make when, on the other hand, they know there is freedom, when they do not know how much grain will arrive, when they hesitate so as to know whether there will be a rise or fall in the amount of grain. All of this, that is to say, that completely concrete element of the behavior of Homo economicus must also be taken into account. So these new measures aimed at the security of food for the population at large, but they worked through the decisions of individual producers, merchants, and consumers by allowing the free circulation of goods. They did not involve the direct confrontation and struggle of contending forces, as suggested by the rhetoric of Foucault's earlier conception of disciplinary power, nor did they involve direct action on the forces of individuals and groups in the manner of disciplinary techniques. Rather, they established conditions under which market incentives would cause individuals to act in ways that would address the problem of shortage. In this manner, they acted indirectly on the actions of others. They didn't seek to directly regulate the production and circulation of grain, but rather to achieve the desired result by allowing the natural mechanisms of the economic cycle to operate. Foucault notes that this manner of exercising power, quoting him, is profoundly linked to the general principle of what is called liberalism. The game of liberalism, not interfering, allowing free movement, letting things follow their course, laisser faire, passer et aller, basically and fundamentally means acting so that reality develops, goes its way and follows its own course according to the laws, principles, and mechanisms of reality itself. Foucault returned to this problem of grain scarcity and the different ways of dealing with it in his final lecture in 1978. The intervening lectures allowed him to situate the debates over grain scarcity in the broader context of criticism of the regulatory style of police government developed in this period. He rehearsed key theses of the criticism of the mercantilist-inspired policy of police in relation to grain production, and suggested that the market solution to the problem of grain shortage embodies a new rationality of government, one that no longer supposes that government regulation can ensure the being and well-being of people. It also involved a new conception of the subjects of government that further specifies their nature as free agents. They are subjects supposed to have certain irreducible interests and supposed to be able to calculate optimal ways of satisfying those interests. In effect, this form of government was one exercised neither over subjects of power or force, as the analysis of disciplinary power had supposed, nor over juridical subjects of right, but rather over subjects of interest. This is, in effect, the government of Homo economicus. Henceforth, Foucault writes, the state is envisioned as the regulator of interests and no longer as the transcendent and synthetic principle of the transformation of the happiness of each into the happiness of all. I think this is a crucial change that brings us face to face with an essential element of the history of the 18th, 19th, and also 20th century. That is to say, what should the state's game be? What role should it play? What function should it perform in relation to that fundamental and natural game of private interests? In this manner, Foucault suggests, by virtue of its reliance on the individual governed as a subject of interest, and by virtue of its mode of acting indirectly on the actions of the government, of the governed rather, the governmentality of the 18th century economists introduces, in Foucault's words, some of the fundamental lines of modern and contemporary governmentality. So all of that to introduce an example of what Foucault means by analyzing governmentality rather than simply the history of political thought or political theory. And it's an example that bears, as I said, on his view of the emergence of specifically liberal governmentality in the mid-18th century. It also bears on changes in his understanding of power and the formula that he put forward in an article published in the early 1980s called The Subject in Power, which set out a radically different concept of power from the one much commented on, discussed in his earlier books like Discipline and Punish. And this is a definition of power in terms of action on the action of others. And I've argued elsewhere that I think this change in Foucault's understanding of power can only be understood in the light of his discovery of governmentality and his study of the emergence of particularly liberal governmentality. The example that I gave, relying on market forces to deal with the problem of grain shortage, is a straightforward and clear example of the way in which the establishment of markets seeks to govern by, as Foucault put it in that formula, acting on the actions of individuals, acting indirectly on what they do and why they do it. Let me turn then to the connections between this analysis of governmentality and normative political theory. So up to this point, the question remains, what's the interest of this genealogical approach to modern governmentality for normative political theory? This is not a question that Foucault ever raised explicitly, but this doesn't mean that there are not implicit responses to be found in these lectures. My suggestion is that there is, in fact, an internal relationship between forms of governmentality and the concepts and principles that provide the building blocks of normative political theory. So this is the first way in which I want to suggest Foucault's genealogy of governmentality in particular bears on political theory, normative political theory. Consider the following two examples. The first, from Foucault's lectures in 1978, concerns the place of individual freedom in the early forms of liberal governmentality as advocated by those 18th century economists. Foucault suggests that the fundamental lines of modern and contemporary governmentality that appeared here for the first time included the need to respect certain freedoms as an indispensable feature of government. As he writes, henceforth, a condition of governing well is that freedom, or certain forms of freedom, are really respected. Failing to respect freedom is not only an abuse of rights with regard to the law, it is above all ignorance of how to govern properly. The integration of freedom and the specific limits to this freedom within the field of governmental practice has now become an imperative. So in the light of this, it's entirely plausible to see that the concepts of freedom that were theorized explicitly at the end of the 18th century and in the 19th century by theorists like John Stuart Mill, builds on an understanding of freedom as essential to the practice of government that developed in the course of the 18th century. It's in this way I want to suggest that Foucault's analysis bears on the building blocks of liberal normative political theory. A second example comes from Foucault's lectures the following year in 1979. And this occurs at a point at the end of the fourth lecture in that course, when he raises the question of a distinctively socialist governmentality. In the context of canvassing reasons why the post-war German socialists adopted neoliberal government, he notes in passing that there has never been an autonomous socialist governmentality, and that indeed socialist regimes in Europe have always operated in conjunction with extrinsic non-socialist governmentalities, such as liberalism or the forms of hyper-administration associated with police governmentality, police in the 18th century sense. At this point, and in a decidedly non-descriptive tone, turned toward the future, as he put it, Foucault asks, what would really be the governmentality appropriate to socialism? Is there a governmentality appropriate to socialism? His answer was that if there really was an autonomous socialist governmentality, then this was something that remained to be invented. There is every reason to think that Foucault raised this question about socialist governmentality in the light of a genuine commitment to socialist ideals. The editor of these lectures, Michel Sénélas, points out that Foucault had been involved in efforts to renew the political culture of the French left, in particular in association with elements of the so-called second left within the French Socialist Party. Sénélas notes that an important part of the historical and political context in which these lectures were prepared was indeed the failure of the left to win an anticipated electoral victory in France in March 1978. He and others suggest, Foucault's former assistant, François Uvalde, also suggests that Foucault's comments on socialist governmentality should be read in the light of the fact that these lectures in general tended to function in part as a commentary on political issues of the day. This is a point that that Uvalde makes about Foucault's approach to these public lectures at the Collège de France, that they were a number of things, but one of the things that they did was to comment on political issues of the day. So my suggestion is that in raising this question about socialist governmentality, Foucault does in fact implicitly acknowledge a role for normative theory, even if he didn't pursue this path, and even though he would have rejected the suggestion that it was for political philosophers to tell people what to do. But my reason for suggesting that he implicitly acknowledges a role here is that it's difficult to imagine how one could answer the question, what would be the governmentality appropriate to socialism, without reference to the features that would allow us to characterize a society as socialist. These might be supposed to involve, for example, the absence or at least the diminution of class differences in relation to wealth, opportunity, or the equal value for all of civil and political liberties. Or it might be supposed to involve equality of opportunity for those similarly endowed and motivated. Whatever their precise form, these features would be features of an ideal society that relied on particular normative conceptions of equality and justice in the distribution of social goods. Foucault doesn't explicitly appeal to or develop such conceptions, but it's clear that answers to his question about the form of governmentality appropriate to socialism would require the kind of detailed elaboration of principles of justice undertaken by Rawls and other liberal egalitarian political philosophers. Turning then to the relevance of questions of governmentality for normative political theory, it would be easy to suppose that there is a fundamental difference between the prescriptive approach to political theory of someone like Rawls and the predominantly descriptive approach we find in Foucault. Rawls sought to provide normative foundations for the government of society, understood, as he put it, as a fair system of cooperation. And he proposed to do this by setting out and arguing for principles of justice that could be agreed to by rational and reasonable persons. By contrast, as I noted earlier, Foucault consistently avoided questions of justification or the legitimation of state power in favor of descriptive questions about the ways in which and the reasons for which power was exercised. In fact, I want to suggest both sides of the contrast between a normative Rawls and a descriptive Foucault proved to be unsustainable. And I've just suggested that normative principles are presupposed by particular forms of governmentality. I now want to suggest that the converse is also true, namely that particular normative theories of political equality, justice, or fairness imply forms of governmentality. In the case of Rawls, even though he presented the principles of justice and fairness as elements of an ideal theory that addressed a simplified model of society, this theory included at least the broad outlines of a conception of government. A theory of justice devoted a chapter to working out, as Rawls put it, the practicable bearing of justice as fairness. And he sets out in this chapter the role of government, namely to provide for public goods that could not otherwise be provided for by market mechanisms, to correct failures and imperfections in market processes, such as those resulting from the emergence of monopolies, lack of information, or external diseconomies, and generally to ensure that the social consequences of a market economy would be aligned with the requirements of justice. And to that end, Foucault proposed a division of government into 4 branches, each with responsibility for particular tasks: an allocation branch that would be responsible for maintaining a competitive price system and ensuring the efficient allocation of resources; a stabilization branch that would seek to maintain full employment and economic stability; a transfer branch that would ensure a minimum social welfare; and finally a distribution branch that would seek to preserve justice in distributive shares by means of taxation and other adjustments to the rights of property. A theory of justice also defended a particular conception of the background economic structure compatible with principles of justice, namely one based on market mechanisms, along with private ownership of capital and natural resources. Rawls's principles of justice were often wrongly supposed to provide an apology for social democratic capitalism. In fact, he always assumed that a government that is consistent with justice as fairness could not allow inequalities of wealth that would undermine the fair value of political liberties or fair equality of opportunity. And for this reason, he argued, government should aim to establish what he called a property-owning democracy, by which he meant, quoting Rawls, a democratic regime in which land and capital are widely, though not presumably, equally held. So in all these ways, Rawls's explicitly normative and utopian conception of a just society included a substantial amount of, in Foucault's phrase, reflection on the best possible way of governing, and indeed on the institutions and techniques of government required. And this is no less true of Rawls's later work, in which the focus shifts from the details of justice as fairness and the background institutions that this requires to the possibility of an overlapping consensus that would provide a framework for public reason about matters of basic justice. Rawls's remarks about the special subject matter, as he called it, of public reason, make it clear that many areas of government policy will fall within the sphere of public reason. For example, he notes that on matters of constitutional essentials and basic justice, the basic structure and its public policies are to be justifiable to all citizens. It follows that key elements of the basic structure, such as the system of property and the policies that regulate the derivation of income from property, will also fall within the sphere of public reason. The conclusion to be drawn from these remarks, I suggest, is that Rawls's public reason will include governmental reason in Foucault's sense of the term.